Some people did something. That is what she said about September 11th. About 3,000 Americans who woke up, poured their coffee, kissed their families goodbye, went to work that crisp Tuesday morning, and simply never came home. Some people did something. The woman who uttered those infamous words is a sitting member of the United States Congress, and on a quiet Tuesday afternoon inside the storied walls of the Russell Senate Office building, a 74-year-old senator from Louisiana sat directly across from her, armed with nothing more than a single piece of paper and 2 words she had never managed to say. I have sat through a lot of hearings in that cavernous building, and if you follow Capitol Hill, you know exactly how these spectacles usually play out. Most of the time, absolutely nothing of substance happens. Politicians read carefully scrubbed statements written by 2, 4-year-old staffers. They ask performative questions they already know the answers to. They clip the exchange for their evening fundraising emails, and everybody goes home. But when Senator John Kennedy reached into the inside breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket that afternoon and pulled out a single, meticulously folded piece of white paper, the atmospheric pressure in the room fundamentally shifted. I knew right then, with the visceral instinct of a veteran political observer, that this one was going to be entirely different. Representative Ilhan Omar came in ready for a fight, because she always comes in ready for a fight. It is her default posture, her political armor. Before Kennedy had even reached out to adjust his microphone, before the ranking committee member had finished mumbling through her boilerplate opening remarks, before anyone in that mahogany-paneled room had uttered a single definitive word about why they were all summoned there, Omar physically leaned into her mic, her eyes locked on the dais, and launched her preemptive strike. "Senator, I know exactly what this is," she declared, her voice ringing with practiced indignation. "This is another Republican show trial, explicitly designed to target the only black Muslim woman in Congress. I have been threatened. I have been ruthlessly harassed. I was sprayed with chemicals at my own town hall by a man who was never even charged. And now you drag me here to weaponize my own words against me." She stared directly into Kennedy's eyes, projecting defiance. "I care about my community. I care deeply about the people I represent. And I will absolutely not be silenced by this hearing or any other. If you have paid any attention to modern political theater, you have heard this exact overture before. It is the impregnable script that runs before every substantive answer, the impenetrable defensive shield that goes up before the very first question is even officially logged into the record. Every single time, in every single hearing room, it is the exact same calculated sequence. I am a target. I am a woman. I am Muslim. I am black. Therefore, your inquiry is not a legitimate question of oversight. It is a malicious, bigoted attack. But watch closely what John Kennedy does with it, because it is an absolute masterclass in legislative dismantling. He waited. He simply waited until the echoes of her grievance faded into the heavy air of the room. He did not interrupt her monologue. He did not let out a frustrated sigh. He did not do that arrogant, dismissive thing that powerful senators reflexively do where they shuffle their briefing binders to signal to the cameras that they are thoroughly unimpressed. He just sat there, remarkably still, and when she was entirely done, he spoke with the measured, deliberate cadence of a man who has been quietly turning something over in his mind for a very long time and has finally found the perfect, crisp Sunday afternoon to lay it all out on the porch. "Well, ma'am, I appreciate you coming," he began, his Louisiana drawl thick but entirely intentional. "And I want to be perfectly clear about something right at the top. This is not a show trial. I don't do shows. Where I come from down in Louisiana, if you want a show, you go down to the state fair and watch somebody guess your weight." A small, collective sound rippled through the gallery, not quite a laugh, but the sudden release of built-up tension. "I'm just going to ask you about some things you said, your own words, in public, on camera, and I would just like to understand what you meant by them. That is all this is." With that, he reached back into his jacket and retrieved that single piece of paper, folded precisely once. He didn't bring a thick manila folder. He didn't slam down a 3-ring binder. He didn't wheel in a towering stack of subpoenaed documents. Just one piece of paper. "I have 5 of your quotes written down right here," Kennedy continued, his eyes dropping to the page. "I wrote them out myself last Sunday because I wanted to make absolutely sure I got them right, and I'd like to go through them with you, if that's all right." It is a role he plays to absolute perfection. The humble, aw-shucks country lawyer who is just trying to make sense of things. The folksy man from the bayou who can't quite wrap his head around all this fast-paced, big city politics. Do not be fooled. It is the most dangerous, deceptive act in the United States Senate. Because lurking right behind that folksy Southern accent is a man who went to Vanderbilt, graduated at the absolute top of his class at the University of Virginia School of Law, and studied extensively at Oxford. He is not confused. He is not slow. He is methodical. And his bottomless patience with Ilhan Omar was about to become a weapon that nobody else in Washington had ever successfully wielded against her. He unfolded the paper with agonizing slowness. Number 1. In 2019, at a fundraiser for the Council on American Islamic Relations, you said the following about the September 11th attacks. He read it deliberately, the way a prosecutor reads a transcript when they want every single syllable to land with concussive force on the jury. Some people did something. He looked up, peering over his glasses. 3,000 Americans died that morning, ma'am. I'd like to understand what you meant by some people. Omar immediately straightened her posture, squaring her shoulders. She had answered this specific inquiry 100 times before. She had a deeply rehearsed, poll-tested response ready to deploy. She firmly believed she was ready for this duel. She was not ready. She was not ready because Kennedy was not actually asking the question she thought he was asking. He wasn't truly interrogating her about September 11th. He was embarking on a surgical examination of her words, how she uses them, who is granted which specific words, and how she manipulates language as a currency of partisan warfare. But by the time she finally realized the trap, the paper would be almost entirely exhausted. For now, Omar let fly her standard defense. Senator, that speech was specifically about Muslim Americans being unjustly treated as second-class citizens in the aftermath of September 11th. I was passionately defending my vulnerable community against rampant discrimination. The full, unedited quote makes that abundantly clear. Republicans have maliciously taken 3 isolated words from a 40-minute speech and used them as a political weapon against me for 5 consecutive years. She delivered it flawlessly. If Kennedy had swaggered in with a gotcha soundbite aggressively clipped from a primetime Fox News broadcast, she would have effortlessly swatted it into the bleachers in 60 seconds flat. That is what she does. It is what has kept her politically viable. But Kennedy didn't come armed with cable news clips. He came with a devastating intellectual trap. I hear you, ma'am. Kennedy nodded gently. Context matters. I agree with you on that completely. So, let's look at more of your words in context. Because if that first quote was truly taken out of context, then your other public words should clearly show me a consistent pattern of someone who profoundly respects the innocent people who died that morning. Let's see if they do. He looked back down at the folded sheet. Number 2. February 2019. You posted on Twitter about American geopolitical support for Israel. You wrote, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." When somebody subsequently asked you who exactly was paying American politicians, you publicly replied, AIPAC. He gently set the paper flat on the wooden table, leaning forward just a fraction. Your own party leadership formally called that a blatant anti-Semitic trope, ma'am. The full House of Representatives passed a bipartisan resolution officially condemning it, and you stood on camera and apologized to the entire country. He paused, his expression perfectly capturing a profound, almost scholarly curiosity, or at least performing that curiosity so flawlessly that the distinction was utterly irrelevant. Did you actually mean that apology? Omar didn't flinch. I did. I learned a great deal from that difficult moment. I grew. I have always forcefully stood against anti-Semitism in every conceivable form. She said she grew. Bookmark that specific word in your mind, because what she inexplicably did exactly 17 months later would definitively reveal to the world whether that claim of growth was genuine or just another layer of political survival. Kennedy nodded slowly, the exact way a wise grandfather nods when he is quietly deciding whether to believe a grandchild's tall tale. Growth is a very good thing, ma'am. I am genuinely glad to hear it. So, let me ask you about what exactly happened after you experienced this growth. He did not pause for dramatic effect between the apology and the devastating pivot that came next. He didn't need to. The narrative trap was already springing shut. September 2021, the House voted on vital funding for the Iron Dome. For the folks at home watching who don't follow international military policy closely, that is a defense system. It doesn't offensively attack anybody. It doesn't invade anybody's sovereign territory. It literally just sits quietly in a field and waits. And when a terrorist rocket is blindly fired at a civilian school or an apartment building full of innocent families sitting down to eat dinner, it shoots that rocket out of the sky before it can obliterate the children inside. He let the sheer gravity of that description settle over the hushed room. The final vote was 420 to 9. 420 members of the United States Congress looked at a purely defensive system that actively protects children from incoming rockets and said yes. Exactly 9 members said no. You, ma'am, were one of the 9. Omar leaned aggressively toward the microphone, her tone sharpening into an irritated edge. The Iron Dome vote was a principled policy position, Senator. I have consistently and vocally questioned blank-check military aid without strict human rights conditions or accountability. That is my fundamental right as an elected member of Congress, and I will absolutely not apologize for exercising it. Kennedy didn't take the bait to argue policy. It is your right. I'm not arguing with that premise. Not even a little bit. He picked the paper back up, his voice dropping into a register of genuine, troubled perplexity. But ma'am, here is the part I just can't get past, the part I've been thinking about since last Sunday on my porch, and I still can't make the math work in my head. You publicly apologized for saying American support for Israel was all bought and paid for with Jewish money. You forcefully claimed you grew. You told the American people you were a fundamentally different, more enlightened person. That was in March of 2019. And then, exactly 17 months later, 17 months after the televised apology, and the supposed growth, and the grand new understanding of anti-Semitism, you cast a deliberate vote against a system that literally catches rockets before they incinerate kindergartens. Not offense, defense. A machine that exists for one singular moral reason, to stop innocent children from being blown to pieces. When you apologized, ma'am, did you actually mean it, or did you only mean it until the television cameras packed up and left? This is the intricate architecture Kennedy was meticulously building. You couldn't fully see the blueprint yet, but to a trained observer, it was breathtaking. He wasn't actually asking about the geopolitical complexities of Israel. He wasn't interrogating her about the lobbying power of AIPAC. He was systematically mapping out precisely how Ilhan Omar deploys her vocabulary. Words that sound morally righteous in public, but mean something chillingly different in practice. An apology that functions as camouflage. Context that is merely a convenient shield. Growth that is an utter illusion. And he was just moments away from zooming out, revealing the entire, horrifying mosaic of her rhetoric to the American public. Kennedy's eyes returned to the paper. Number 3. And this is the last one I'm going to explicitly number, ma'am, because after this specific one, I think you'll clearly see exactly where we are going. The 24th of February, 2026. The State of the Union Address. The President of the United States was speaking directly to a joint session of Congress and the American people. Every single television camera in the country was rolling. He read the transcription with a slow, heavy gravity. You shouted, "You are a murderer." You shouted, "You are a liar." You shouted, "You have killed Americans." Kennedy set the paper down deliberately. Ma'am, 2 Americans tragically died during an ICE law enforcement operation in your district. That is a terrible tragedy. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Then, the entire timbre of his voice shifted, not increasing in volume, but dropping into a low, resonant register that commanded the absolute attention of every soul in the room. But I want to quickly go back to something we discussed earlier. 3,000 Americans died in a fiery inferno on the 11th of September 2001, and you flippantly dismissed it as some people did something. Exactly 2 Americans died during a chaotic law enforcement operation in Minneapolis, and you stood on the floor of the United States Congress, on national television, and screamed murderer at the President of the United States. He folded the paper back over. 3,000 dead equals some people. 2 dead equals murderer. Help me understand your moral system, ma'am, because from where I'm sitting behind this desk, the inflammatory words you pick don't seem to depend on how many innocent people died. They depend entirely on who you happen to be politically angry at. If you are watching this, you remember exactly where you were on September 11th. Every single person tuning in remembers the towering plumes of smoke, the horrific images of people jumping, the desperate, frantic phone calls that went straight to voicemail and were never, ever returned. You carry all of it. Some people did something. And then, just 4 months ago, that exact same woman stood in the historic chamber of the Capitol and shrieked murderer at the commander-in-chief. Not for 3,000 lives extinguished by terrorism, but for 2 lives lost in a local operation. You have been arguing this exact point for years. You've argued it at your kitchen table to your teenage kids who rolled their eyes and told you to calm down. You've argued it to your spouse who gently suggested maybe you were overreacting to the news. You have argued that the rhetoric never matches the reality, that the outrage from the political elite is wildly selective, that the explosive anger follows a strict, partisan formula, and that this formula has absolutely nothing to do with the tragic loss of human life and everything to do with which political team is currently holding the ball. Let me tell you right now, you were never overreacting. You were absolutely right. If that mathematical realization just hit you in the gut the way it hit me the first time, I actually stopped and added it up. 3,000 dead gets some people, while 2 dead gets murderer. If that sickening arithmetic has been sitting heavy in your chest for years and nobody with a prominent microphone has ever had the spine to say it out loud on national television, then this channel is your home. Subscribe right now, because John Kennedy was not even close to being finished. Omar knew she was trapped. You could visibly see the subtle, frantic shift in her body language. She had confidently walked into that room expecting a predictable, disjointed list of standard Republican grievances that she could easily swat away one at a time with practiced talking points. What she violently collided with instead was a crystal-clear mirror, and the political reflection staring back at her was starting to look like something she had desperately intended to keep hidden in the dark. So, cornered and bleeding political capital, she defaulted to the only maneuver she knows when the ground beneath her begins to collapse. She went on the offensive. "Senator, this is exactly what I am talking about," she flared, her voice rising in defensive pitch. "This is exactly what you do. This is what all of you on that side of the aisle do. You weaponize grief. You cynically take real human tragedy and you twist it into cheap political theater. You don't actually care about September 11th. You don't care about those 2 people who died in Minneapolis. The only thing you care about is exploiting death to score cheap partisan points against a black Muslim woman who dares to aggressively speak truth to power in this exclusionary building." She pointed a trembling finger directly at him. "This sham of a hearing is not about my word. It is about systemic intimidation, and the American people can clearly see right through it. Here is the complex reality. She wasn't entirely wrong in her broader premise. Politicians do, in fact, weaponize grief. Both sides of the aisle are guilty of it. And that specific word, intimidation, landed with a heavy, uncomfortable thud in a room where Ilhan Omar was the only woman, the only practicing Muslim, and the only person of color sitting at the witness table. The accusation landed, and it just sat there, radioactive, in the dead air. For about 30 agonizing seconds, the collective consciousness of the room was genuinely unsure who was actually winning the exchange. She effectively called his devastating cross-examination the weaponization of grief. She labeled it racist intimidation. And honestly, from where she was physically sitting, with the unforgiving glare of the network cameras focused entirely on her and a 7-4-year-old white, Southern conservative man reading her own incendiary quotes back to her, I can somewhat understand why her survival instinct led her to feel that way. But what John Kennedy did in the very next moment is the exact reason I am fiercely compelled to tell you this story. Share this with someone who desperately needs a masterclass in political maneuvering, because it was brilliant. Kennedy did not reflexively fire back. He didn't turn red and bang his gavel. He simply sat with her explosive accusation, holding it the way a thoughtful man sits with a scalding cup of black coffee he knows he isn't quite ready to drink yet. 10 full seconds of total, suffocating silence in a congressional hearing room is an eternity. "Ma'am," Kennedy finally said, his voice soft, almost contemplative. "You might actually be right about that. Maybe politicians do cynically weaponize grief. I'll sit with that criticism. I've probably been guilty of doing it myself at times without even fully knowing it. I'm from Louisiana, ma'am. We certainly aren't perfect either." He let that stunning admission land softly in the center of the room, and what that strategic concession did was something absolutely no one in the press gallery expected. It completely neutralized the weapon in Omar's hand. You cannot aggressively fight a man who just calmly agreed with your harshest premise. "But," Kennedy pivoted, the trap now fully armed, "I want to talk about something right now that isn't about grief at all. I want to talk about something that is just pure, unadulterated arithmetic. Because you clearly use incredibly strong, violent words about death. Some people, murderer. You feel intensely strongly about who gets to live, who tragically dies, and exactly whose fault it is. I understand that passion. I respect it. So, let me ask you about one specific death. Not a broad policy death, not a faceless statistic on a chart. A young man who was vibrant and alive one evening and dead the very next morning, and the exact, specific words you actively chose to use for him. He didn't even say number 4. The rigid numbering system was discarded. This was no longer an interrogation. This was a profoundly uncomfortable conversation. The 10th of September 2025. Charlie Kirk was brutally shot and killed on the campus of Utah Valley University. He was just 31 years old. He left behind a grieving wife. He had 2 small, terrified children. Kennedy paused, not for cheap theatrical effect, but because a sentence of that magnitude simply needed room to breathe. 14 hours later, ma'am, just 14 hours after a young father was shot through the neck and bled out on a college campus, you went on a popular podcast, and the things you eagerly said about him are things I am categorically refusing to repeat in this hearing room out of respect, because his traumatized family might be watching this broadcast right now. He locked his gaze onto hers, unblinking. 2 days after that horrific murder, you went on X, and you deliberately reposted a highly produced video. The video explicitly called the murdered Charlie Kirk Dr. Frankenstein. It boldly proclaimed, and I am quoting the exact video you voluntarily shared with your 4 million dedicated followers, "His monster shot him through the neck." He set the piece of paper flat on the table, placing both of his hands firmly on top of it. Ma'am, his body was not even in the ground yet when you gleefully posted that. Omar's posture grew rigid, her jaw set. I was aggressively criticizing dangerous, escalatory rhetoric. She fired back, refusing to yield an inch. The exact kind of reckless rhetoric that inevitably leads to the very political violence we saw. I have been a relentless target of that exact rhetoric my entire career. I have received credible death threats. I was physically attacked at my own community town hall. I know intimately what real political violence looks like. Kennedy's voice remained impossibly steady. I believe you, ma'am. I know the threats you face are very real, and I am genuinely sorry you have to endure them. He let a long, heavy pause hang between them. But his wife was literally still sitting in the hospital waiting room when you went on that podcast. His young children were still at home, utterly broken. And exactly 14 hours after their father was shot through the neck, you eagerly told the entire world that he had it coming. Criticizing dangerous rhetoric is absolutely your First Amendment right. You could have powerfully done it a week later, a month later, a year later. You could have stood up and simply said, political violence is always wrong, full stop, no matter who the victim is or what they politically believe. But you deliberately chose not to say that. 14 hours after a man was slaughtered, you went on a microphone and told your audience it was his own fault. And 2 days later, you amplified a video that disgustingly called him Dr. Frankenstein and made a sick joke about how his own monster shot him through the neck. Kennedy's voice dropped even quieter, not louder. That is his ultimate trick. The more fundamentally devastating the material he is delivering, the softer, more intimate his voice becomes. Ma'am, I am 74 years old. I have been in the brutal arena of public life for a very long time. I have undoubtedly said things in the heat of the moment that I desperately wish I could take back. Every honest person in the world has. But I have never, not once in my entire life, looked at a man who was violently murdered in cold blood and publicly declared that he deserved it before his grieving widow had even left the hospital. You are a murderer. Those were your chosen words for a sitting president. For a young man who was actually, literally murdered, your chosen words were, he had it coming 14 hours later. Here is what Kennedy brilliantly never said out loud, because he didn't need to. The overarching pattern was already agonizingly visible to anyone with eyes to see, a chilling psychological map drawn entirely in Omar's own ink. 3,000 innocent people dead. Some people did something. A murdered young conservative father. Dr. Frankenstein, his monster shot him. 2 people tragically killed in a chaotic ICE operation. You are a murderer. The specific words constantly morph. The volume violently shifts. The manufactured outrage gets exponentially louder or dismissively softer, sharper or much duller, depending on one solitary, uncompromising metric. Not how many innocent people died, not the horrific manner in which they died, not whether they left behind weeping children or shattered families or stolen futures. Only this. Which political team were they playing for? $250. $1 million. That is the staggering number Kennedy dropped next. and the sheer weight of it shattered whatever defensive illusion remained in the room. If you have been watching this gripping saga and wondering how on earth a person can recklessly call a sitting president a murderer and publicly mock a dead father in the exact same calendar year and still sit comfortably in the United States Congress, rest assured, you are not alone. What comes next is the specific part that made me physically stop the footage and rewatch it twice in sheer disbelief. Leave a comment below. Tell me honestly if you knew anything about this massive scandal before tonight. Kennedy slowly picked up the folded paper one last time, but he didn't read a quote, because this particular point was entirely different. This wasn't about something Ilhan Omar boldly said. It was about something she conspicuously, deafeningly did not say. Ma'am, I want to pivot and talk about your home district, Minneapolis, your beloved community. The very people you passionately claimed you care so much about just a few minutes ago. Let's talk about Feeding Our Future, a massive federal nutrition program that operated directly inside your district. It was specifically designed to feed incredibly vulnerable, low-income children during the height of the pandemic. Desperate children who were going to bed hungry. He paused, letting the word hungry echo. $250 million was systematically stolen from that vital program. Not accidentally misspent, not bureaucratically misallocated. Stolen. Pillaged by a highly organized network of criminals who set up completely fake ghost meal sites and fraudulently billed the federal government for millions of meals that were never cooked, never served, to phantom children who were never even there. He paused again, his eyes narrowing. And do you want to know the part that literally keeps me up at night, ma'am? The state government had exactly 2 employees checking for fraud. 2 people in the entire massive system, $250 million heavily flowing through a dark pipeline, and exactly 2 people passively watching the gate. He held up a finger. 1 massive investigation, 60 people federally charged, the vast majority of them operating right out of your district. Ma'am, the absolute ringleader of this despicable enterprise, a woman named Amy Bach, was sentenced just last month to 41 years in federal prison. She explicitly told federal investigators that you personally knew all about the massive fraud. Your congressional office aggressively says you didn't know a thing. I'm actually not going to interrogate you about that specific dispute today. I'm going to ask you something much, much simpler. He leaned in, the folksy demeanor entirely gone, replaced by cold, hard accountability. You stood on national television and ferociously called the President of the United States a murderer. In front of every impressionable child in America who was watching, you deliberately deployed that incredibly heavy word, murderer. Meanwhile, $250 million was ruthlessly stolen from a program designed solely to put hot food in front of starving children right in your district, happening directly under your watch. 60 people indicted, 41 years in federal lockup for the mastermind. What specific, powerful word did you boldly use for them? Silence. Absolute crushing silence. Because I looked, ma'am. I had my staff scour the records. I personally went through every single one of your public statements, every slick press release, every rapid-fire tweet, every Sunday morning cable news interview. I could not find one single, solitary time you publicly called anyone involved in that heinous scandal a thief. Not once. You have murderer loaded in the chamber for a president, but you have nothing but total, absolute silence for the criminals who literally stole food from the mouths of starving children. You vehemently said you care about your community. Those were your exact words 15 minutes ago. Your community's poorest children were going hungry, and $250 million was being shamelessly stolen from the very program meant to sustain them, and you somehow had absolutely no words for that monumental tragedy at all. Kennedy didn't even wait for her to formulate an excuse, because the trail of evidence was almost at its devastating end. And just one more thing, ma'am, because, again, this is just simple math, and I'd really like to understand how it works. When you first entered the halls of Congress in 2019, your official financial disclosures showed very modest working-class assets, which makes perfect sense. You were a grassroots community organizer. You worked tirelessly in struggling nonprofits. However, your most recent financial disclosure shows that your husband's sprawling company is now valued at close to $10 million, a boutique winery in California, a lucrative venture capital firm. The Department of Justice has officially opened a serious investigation into your tangled personal finances and your highly questionable campaign spending. He waved his hand dismissively. "I'm not going to badger you about the ongoing investigation today. That is strictly between you and the DOJ. But I will ask you to reconcile this staggering coincidence. $250 million was brazenly stolen from starving children's food programs in your district. And during that exact same time frame, your personal household wealth skyrocketed from community organizer money to a lavish $10 million portfolio. You instantly had a devastating word for the president. You instantly had a cruel word for Charlie Kirk 14 hours after he bled out. You easily found a dismissive word for 3,000 dead Americans on September 11th. But for the ruthless criminals stealing from vulnerable children in your own backyard, and for the massive, unexplained millions suddenly showing up in your own household bank accounts, ma'am, you inexplicably had absolutely no words at all. There was nothing left for me, or anyone else, to add. Kennedy had meticulously laid it all bare. With deliberate slowness, Kennedy folded that single piece of paper once the exact same precise fold he had made when he first extracted it from his suit pocket 20 grueling minutes ago. He quietly slipped it back inside his breast pocket. 5 devastating quotes. One single piece of paper. The dismantling was complete. He looked directly at Omar, his expression softening into something resembling profound, melancholic pity. "Ma'am, I have been closely listening to you speak for 7 years. I've listened in fiery committee hearings, on the evening news, screaming on the floor of the House, headlining political rallies, dominating town halls, and speaking on endless podcasts. And I want to tell you something right now that I mean with absolute, complete sincerity. You are arguably one of the most incredibly talented, magnetic public speakers I have ever witnessed in government, and believe me, I have seen a whole lot of them come and go. You possess a rare, undeniable gift for words. Real, potent words. The kind of electric words that make exhausted people stand up in their living rooms. The kind of words that make people intensely, righteously angry. The kind of powerful words that make alienated people feel like somebody powerful finally stood up and said exactly what they were secretly thinking. But here is the heartbreaking thing I have noticed over all these years. You have eagerly used a lot of incredibly dark words to describe this country, ma'am. Murderer, racist, colonial, apartheid. Some people did something. You have systematically used virtually every vile derogatory word in the English dictionary to tear down America. He paused, and the entire room paused right alongside him. 200 people, staff, journalists, and politicians, collectively holding their breath, not a single one of them making a sound. You've used every word except 2. In 7 long years, ma'am. In 7 years of comfortably sitting in the United States Congress, occupying a seat of immense power that this very country made entirely possible for you. A benevolent country that unconditionally took you in when you were a desperate 2-year-old girl, a terrified refugee fleeing the violence of Somalia with absolutely nothing to your name. This country gave you unprecedented safety. It gave you full, equal citizenship. It gave you a world-class education, and it ultimately gave you a highly coveted seat in the most powerful, consequential legislature on the face of the earth. And yet, in 7 years, utilizing all of those millions of fiery words, you have never, not even once, stood at a public microphone and uttered the 2 simple words that every single parent in America makes sure to teach their child before they teach them anything else. Thank you. The heavy, almost religious silence that descended upon the Russell Senate office building was unlike anything the jaded Washington press corps had ever witnessed, leaving Representative Ilhan Omar completely frozen and stripped of her usual impenetrable identity shield. For the first time in her career, she didn't aggressively lean into the microphone to cry racism, declare a Republican show trial, or claim the weaponization of grief, paralyzed not by a lost policy debate, but by the undeniable, suffocating weight of her own words. Senator John Kennedy's meticulous, chronological trap had exposed a chilling psychological map, eagerly deploying the word murderer for a sitting president, dismissing 3,000 dead innocents as some people, amplifying a cruel joke about a murdered father while his wife wept, and offering absolute, complicit silence for the thieves who stole millions from starving children. Yet, the most devastating blow of the afternoon was the revelation of what she had never said. In 7 years of wielding unprecedented American privilege, wealth, and power extraordinary blessings given freely by a nation that took her in as a terrified refugee. She had never once stepped to a microphone to utter the two fundamental words of grace every working-class mother teaches her. Child, thank you. While millions of everyday immigrants quietly whisper their profound gratitude for a beautiful, flawed country that allows them to build a life from scratch, and while millions of ordinary Americans go to work feeling a quiet pride they never broadcast on the internet, this powerful congresswoman weaponized every word in her vast arsenal to tear that very nation down. But the true masterstroke happened just as the network cameras abruptly clicked off and the stunned gallery began to empty. A sharp-eyed staffer noticed a chilling detail the live broadcast had entirely missed. Kennedy hadn't just put away his single piece of paper. He had deliberately left a small manila envelope bearing the unmistakable, embossed official seal of the Department of Justice, resting directly on the polished edge of Omar's desk, an explosive final gesture guaranteeing that this tense political showdown was about to escalate into something far, far more dangerous.